Hello and welcome to Travels Through Time. Hello, I'm Peter Moore. In the early Middle Ages, a mighty king called Offa ruled over the region of Mercia in the centre of Britain. Shortly after his death, it was recorded that Offa's power was so great that it was felt right across the Isles. But beyond this, great gaps of knowledge were left by the chroniclers of the time. Rory Naismith is an academic at the University of Cambridge, and he has spent much of his career gathering together the evidence that does remain of a man that he describes as being of paramount interest to the historian. His book, Offa King of the Mercians, is just out, and I spoke to him about one significant year in Offa's story just the other day. Welcome to Travels Through Time, Rory Naismith. You write that Anglo-Saxon history is full of lost people and lost places. Do you think Offa, King of the Mercians, the character who appears in your book, which I have right here with me, is one of the biggest losses of all?
I think in a lot of ways the answer is yes. We know who he was, we know when he reigned, but beyond that, it's really, really hard to piece a lot of information together. You don't have a biography of him, or at least not a reliable contemporary biography of him. You don't really have very much that comes from Offa himself, and not even all that much that comes from within his own kingdom that gives you the perspective of his own subjects. So we know enough to know how interesting and important he was, but we don't have enough to really flesh him out as much as I and a lot of other historians would really like to.
Okay. You say he was a great ruler whose legacy was tainted by ideas about belligerence and misdeeds. If people are just starting to picture who Offa might have been in their mind, do we have the archetypal strongman as a good starting point?
Yes, I think so. If anyone knows anything about Offa, it will probably be about Offa's Dyke, this great big monument, this great big defence that is built between the English and the Welsh that runs the whole length of the border. And so if someone's building a fortification on that scale, it's a clue that they mean business. You know, they are someone who isn't going to hesitate to use violence when it's needed. I think where Offa suffers is that that's one major survival from his reign. The other major survival is not from his own kingdom, but it's this document known as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It's the tentpole source for Anglo-Saxon history. It's where an awful lot of the core dates, the core information about battles and things like that comes from. And this is written in Wessex, which is the main rival kingdom in southern England to Offa, about 100 years after Offa's death. And it draws on sources from Canterbury in earlier times, which was another place where Offa's reputation was not particularly good. And so this means that on several levels, they've got incentives not to say much about Offa, and what they do say is pretty negative. It's that he fights battles, he kills a saint, and that's about it.
Yeah, because it's almost the opposite. I know you quote Churchill early on in your introduction, but there's that famous line of Churchill's where he says that history is going to be kind to me for I intend to write it. It's almost the opposite of that, isn't it? Because history was bound to be unkind to Offa because his enemies were the first person to put it down on paper or parchment.
Pretty much. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think he suffers a lot from being known primarily from the writings of his rivals, his enemies, and then later people who just went to town with those negative stories that had been written down by people who were not his fans.
Could I ask you a little bit about sources? Because this is such an important question for you. I know you say you're not writing a biography, you're writing more a story of a king and how he fits into the great story of how Britain evolved. That's an important point, but the sources are frustratingly elusive. You mentioned that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is a paramount one for you. I believe it's called the Parker Chronicle, which is at Corpus Christi. Is that where you are at the moment? Because I think there's a real connection between the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Corpus Christi, and I just thought it'd be nice to ask you about that.
You're absolutely right. I'm a fellow of Corpus Christi College, wonderful place, and one of the great jewels in the crown of Corpus is the Parker Library, which was formed in the 16th century by Matthew Parker, the Archbishop of Canterbury under Elizabeth I, and he used, I wouldn't say abused, but he used his position, his influence to collect up all sorts of manuscripts, medieval manuscripts that he thought were interesting and especially that were useful in constructing his view of English history and particularly of the English Church. And one of the manuscripts that he got hold of was the oldest surviving copy of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Parker Chronicle, which was produced in Sudling, probably in Winchester, in the year, about the year 900. The earliest part of it comes from about the year 900. And then chunks are added to it as you go through the 10th century, the 11th century. It's one of about half a dozen manuscript copies of this chronicle, the so-called Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which were written in various times and places, but this is the oldest one by a significant margin. And it's a real pleasure to be able to work with it.
And how does Offa appear in it? Where does he appear in it, or does he appear in it substantially at all?
He doesn't appear in it that substantially. You hear about when he comes to the throne. This is in the year 757. It starts out with this very long-lived king who'd come before, Athelbald, king of the Mercians. He dies at some point, probably on the earlier side of that year. We don't have an exact date. And then he is replaced very briefly by a character called Beornred, and he's basically just a name. You know, you could fit everything we know about Beornred onto a postage stamp, basically. And then Offa comes along, also still within the year 757, and ousts him and takes over as king. So you do get that story, albeit reduced to about a sentence and a half. Then you get information about a couple of battles, a couple of military actions that Offa is involved in the 770s. And then you get information about how in 787 he establishes a new archbishopric at Lichfield, then has his son crowned king by this new archbishop. And then in 796 he dies.
Yeah.
And the other major thing is in 794 he has Ethelbert of East Anglia, who is later cultivated as a saint, beheaded.
So there's a few tantalising moments in there, which I suppose you've got to make of what you will. And I should say, as someone who grew up sort of just north of Lichfield, I should say that he's someone who I feel a bit of kinship with. It's maybe a good time to ask you now just to sketch the boundaries of what Mercia was, because it's essentially, well, I'll let you do it because you'll do it much better than me, but it's a pretty big place, isn't it? It's a good big area.
It is. I think the core part of it is it's effectively the West Midlands. You just said that you come from the beautiful countryside around Lichfield. That's the heart of Mercia. Lichfield, Tamworth, Repton. These are places that seem to have been central to the Mercian kingdom and the Mercian dynasty. That's where it started. By the time of Offa, the kingdom of the Mercians, at its greatest extent, is very big indeed. It's everything from the Humber, which separates Northumbria from Mercia, down to the Channel, because they've taken over Sussex, they've taken over Kent, they've taken over London, they've taken over East Anglia. Everything south of the Humber, except for Wessex, basically, is part of the Mercian kingdom. It's usually associated with the Midlands more generally. Like a lot of those kingdoms in the east and the south turn out to be temporary additions. They break away and do their own thing, or they're taken over by the West Saxons in the 9th century. So you've got the core area of Mercia, which is that bit of the West Midlands. Then you've got a large chunk of territory that runs from Offa's Dyke in the west to the Fens in the east, roughly where I am now in Cambridge, Humber in the north, and the Thames in the south. That big square of territory in the middle is the area of Mercia at the beginning of Offa's reign and then after Offa's time as well.
It's funny how it seems to live on in 2026 in West Mercia Police Force. That seems to be about the only place I've come across this in active use today. But it is there. It's worth talking about Offa's Dyke as well, just for a moment, because of the Roman period and the early Middle Ages, you have these two great constructions. First of all, Hadrian's Wall, named after Hadrian, and you have Offa's Dyke, which I suppose act as a bit of a map into or a biographical map into that chunk of history, long period of time, of course. But it's worth saying and stressing what an extraordinary archaeological thing Offa's Dyke is. I read once that a historian said that it was comparable to the effort needed to build the pyramids in Egypt. What was needed to be done to build this 80 miles earthwork along the border with Wales. So what does it tell us?
It tells us a lot. First of all, it's even bigger than that. It's more like 150 miles than 80 miles, because it does really seem to run from the north coast of Wales down to the south coast of Wales, with only a few gaps where it coincides with a big river. And, well, you can use the river instead of the dike, basically, for those points. It's a huge effort. It's monumentally impressive, even to us now. If you go to the best preserved parts of it, it's still several meters high at the top of the dike, as it were, and then several meters deep in the ditch. It's a big operation. And there's a lot of people who spent a lot of time and imagination trying to work out how many people it might have taken to build it, how quickly they could have built it. And it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string kind of question, because if you got more men, you could build it more quickly. If you got not quite as many men, it would take a bit longer. But I think that if you've got, say, 10,000 workers, which is a lot, it's not implausible, but it's a lot for the period, it could have been done pretty quickly. It could have been a matter of, I think it's months of actual hard labor, which could have been spread out over a longer period. But it's big, but if you've got a large kingdom and a lot of labor to draw upon, you could make it come together quite fast. There's been a lot of debate over the years about just how much of it really was built by Offa, whether it is one single contiguous entity or whether it's actually combining several elements that have been built at different times. So at one point it was thought, for example, that only a stretch of about 60 or 70 miles around the middle was Offa's Dyke, and everything else was just other dikes built by other people that had been sort of tacked on incorrectly. The most recent research actually is a bit more optimistic. It's thought that it probably was pretty much a single operation that really did run from sea to sea, which is how it's described in the first written reference to it, which comes from the reign of Alfred the Great. And you already mentioned Hadrian's Wall, which is actually a very important point of reference. It's quite likely they were thinking of Hadrian's Wall when they built this, because it also was said by Bede and by Gildas and presumably thought by others to run from sea to sea. And it was believed to have been built in the early Middle Ages by the Romans or by the Britons under Roman orders to keep out the barbarians coming from the north. So for Offa to build a very similar kind of defense against the Welsh is a strong statement of who is now in control. Because for the Welsh, their cherished heritage, their cherished belief was that they were the original and rightful inhabitants of Britain, and the English were just unwelcome interlopers, basically. And so for Offa to build the dike and to be the one who's hemming in the Welsh in that way, it's a statement that he is now the one, he and the English are the ones who are running Britain, and the Welsh are the barbarians, basically.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point of comparison, isn't it, between those two things? So it's worth pointing out. Probably a slightly sad point of comparison with HS2, which seems to have taken us much longer. And I'm glad that you pointed out it was 150 miles long Offa's Dyke, because I think that is actually longer than HS2 first.
Yeah.
So we can make some historical comparisons there. But if we imagine, so you've got this border there with Wales, you've got the Humber, this area south of the Humber. I'm imagining there wasn't such a thing as Offa's London. I guess that's slightly apart.
Well, actually, London was quite a big deal by Offa's time. I mean, in terms of its overall size, it's pretty puny. It's maybe, 5,000 people on a permanent basis, something like that. So that's a market town nowadays. But in relative terms, that made it a bustling metropolis. There weren't many other places of anything like that scale in the 8th century. And Offa was actually quite keen on London. He spent a lot of time there. He had a lot of his major meetings with aristocrats and bishops there. It's one of the major places that makes his coins. It's a big part of his kingdom.
Yeah. But if we're sketching these boundaries here, and this is a big question for you when you're writing, what did it mean to be a king in this area, in this region. It's not really what we have in our mind as, I suppose, people will instantly think of the Tudors or earlier Plantagenet rulers. It's not like that, is it? The central command is not so powerful.
Well, it's certainly different. I wouldn't say it's necessarily less powerful. I think it just operates quite differently, because a figure like Offa, he could do a lot, and he could intervene really on quite a granular scale when he wanted to. And we'll come on to that in a minute, because one of the major sources we have for this is a letter that comes between him and Charlemagne that talks about how he's very closely involved with really quite specific, detailed aspects of trade. What we can say is that all of this is being done without much in the way of bureaucracy. It doesn't leave much of a paper trail. It's being done by dealing with people, dealing with other kings, representatives of other kings, bishops, characters like that. And so a major part of what made Offa's kingdom work and how Offa demonstrated his status, his position, was who went to see whom and when and where. So Offa is really keen on having these big centralized meetings where he gets all the people with important business from across his entire kingdom. So not just Mercia, but also East Anglia, Kent, Sussex, places like that. They all have to come to him at the same place. So it's a very, very potent way of binding together this new unit that didn't really have a prior existence. He's making everyone come and deal with him in that way. So I think he's working in a very different way from Henry VIII or Elizabeth I. And I think it's easy to think it must be even more primitive and even more alien than it really was. I think it was different, but it wasn't necessarily quite as backwards as we might assume. It just doesn't leave much of a paper trail.
That's interesting. We've got a couple of other questions which are bouncing around in my head. I just want to put them to you before we get into our scenes, which is where we're going to look at this much more closely. But I know you've written quite a lot about coinage and money. It's been a central interest for you academically. And there's this famous coin Offa had produced, which looks very much like an Islamic dirham. Is that correct? And I just thought that was such a tantalizing glimpse into maybe this not being the localized, isolated islands that we might imagined, but it having, I know we'll probably explore this more in the scenes actually, but the idea that even somewhere that begins in Tamworth might have connections to caliphates far away. Is that correct?
It is correct. There's this remarkable and still completely unique gold coin, which has got, it's an imitation of in fact, it's a gold dinar. It's the high value currency that was used in the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th and 9th centuries. And it has Offa's name and title inserted in the middle of the Arabic. So yeah, it's been a mystery, a really tantalizing thing ever since it first came to light in the 1840s. Unfortunately, it's not known exactly where or in what circumstances it was found. It just surfaces in the collection of a French diplomat who was based in Rome in the mid-19th century, which could well mean it was found in Rome, but we can't be 100% sure of that. It's probably not made for direct trade with the Muslim world. That's important to stress, because if you did turn up in Baghdad or Cairo or Muslim Spain with one of these coins, people would give you very funny looks and then pack you off to the local jail, because this is manifestly not a proper local coin. It looks very, very different, and the Arabic is full of mistakes. It's not so bad that you can't read what they're modelling it on. You can even tell what the date was of the original, which was I think it's 157 years after the Hijrah, which translates to 773 or 4 AD. And Offa's name is inserted upside down relative to the Arabic. So clearly they knew it was jolly important to replicate all these, what to them would have just been lines and squiggles, but they didn't have a clue what it actually meant. And that's probably a good thing, because they might have hesitated if they knew it all said things like, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, which is exactly the formulation that you get on this thing. It's most likely to have been produced to fit in with how high status payments are being made internationally in Western Europe itself, because they're using gold dinars and they're using Byzantine gold coins to do exactly that. They're moving about over long distances. They're not being reminted when they enter a new kingdom in the same way that silver coins are. And so Offa's dinar may well have been made for something like paying money to the Pope, which is rather bizarre when you think it's got these Muslim professions of faith on it. But we do have good evidence that coins known as mancuses, or mancusi in Latin, these were the preferred currency for paying settling large value transactions in Italy at this time. And there's even a letter written by one of Offa's successors, a guy called Cernwulf, written to one of Offa's successors by the Pope, suggesting that Cernwulf might want to maintain Offa's custom of sending 365 gold mancuses to Rome every year. So we can't be categorically sure, but there's a very good chance that this gold coin is actually one of those gold mancuses that Offa makes to send to Rome as an act of charity, demonstration of how much reverence the English have got for St. Peter and for the Pope, and this is the only one that survived.
Among all these fragments of evidence, it's something like the Joker in the pack, that one, isn't it? It seems to be one that you can really look at and wonder about. Let's get on with it then. I'm going to leave my other questions to one side for a moment because I've got a more important one to put to you, Rory Naismith. If you could travel back through time to a calendar year, which one would you pick?
I think 796 would be a good year.
Well done, first of all. I'll let you set it up. But I did my research about 796 as well. And just 2 points for a bit of scene setting. This is the year when Charlemagne organises an invasion of modern-day Hungary. It's a big week in Hungarian politics, so we'll get that one in as well. And also, maybe this gives a bit of a hint about the period as well. This was when Northumbria was plunged into chaos in the spring with the murder of King Athelred.
Yes, who is in fact Offa's son-in-law. He's married to one of Offa's daughters.
Exactly. So time seems like a time of, expansion for some big powers, which we'll get onto in a moment, but also real peril at home among the closest people in your entourage, because Ethelred was murdered perhaps by his supporters. I don't know. Anyway, that's another question. You told me about 796. Why do you want to go there?
Well, it's the climax of Offa's reign, really. We know that he dies in the course of this year. We know that Mercia itself goes through a lot of change in this year. It's a wonderful moment when you can see a lot of the things that have been going on in the 8th century coming to an end, and a lot of the other developments that would characterize the 9th century starting to come into being. So we've got political change in how Mercia relates to other parts of England. We've got changes in the dynasty that's running that kingdom. We've got interesting relationships going on with Charlemagne, with mainland Europe. The other thing to mention, of course, is this is only a couple of years after the first known Viking raids in England. So these are also starting to bubble up. At this moment, they're probably not an existential threat to Mercia or Wessex or any of these other kingdoms. They're shocking because they target these monasteries which were revered and full of manuscripts and treasure that the Vikings were plundering, and this was seen as a result of God's displeasure with the English. So they were racking their brains about what they must have done wrong. And in time, of course, the Vikings would become a much more serious danger. So you can trace, in the context of this one year, some of these movements taking place, some of these bigger step changes in earlier medieval history beginning to pick up steam.
Mercia is the big player, perhaps, at this time. Is that fair to say?
That's right. Mercia is very, very good at playing this game of bringing together smaller units and then combining them into one. So Offa's trying to take this a step even further with East Anglia, with Kent, with these other places. And that doesn't quite end up sticking, but they've done it very well with lots of other places in the Midlands. So there's this document, this very important but also incredibly frustrating document called the Tribal Hidage, or called by historians the Tribal Hidage, which just lists 30-odd groups in the Midlands and the number of hides, the number of family units each consisted of. And some of these are very little. They're only about 300 or 400 hides, and especially in the region around where I am in Cambridgeshire, the region of the sort of southeast Midlands, there are loads and loads of these little groups. And there are others that are only known from the place names. So it's a very layered world. You've got lots of these local come regional units which have got their own heritage, their own identity, their own history, which sometimes stick around for a long, long time, centuries after they've been absorbed into a bigger kingdom. They just become the equivalent of the counties or the shires of Mercia. The divisions are based on these earlier pre-existing groups who've been part of the Mercian regime, in some cases for generations.
And above all this, you have the great figure of Offa, who is overseeing things. Let's go and explore his personality from what evidence we can find. Where should we go for our first scene then, please?
Well, I thought a good place to start is with this letter that I mentioned briefly before, which we know is sent by Charlemagne to Offa at some point in probably the first half of 796. It's actually ghostwritten by a character called Alcuin of York, who is himself English. He's a star pupil of the cathedral school in York, who's ended up spending a lot of his career in mainland Europe, working with Charlemagne, often, in fact, at the court of Charlemagne. And he's got a very wide circle of correspondence, including lots of people in Mercia and in Northumbria. So the letters to and from him are a major source for what's going on in this period. But this one is quite unusual. This is Alcuin writing in the voice of Charlemagne, as it were, to Offa, and it's one of the first letters between two kings from anywhere in earlier medieval Europe, and it's full of fascinating details. You can see how Charlemagne refers to Offa. There's lots of very purple language here about how great it is that kings have got brotherly bonds with each other, how they can be peaceful and communicate with each other in a very civilized way. This wasn't always how things had worked between the two of them, but that's how they choose to frame it here, which is quite telling in itself. You have to use a lot of this boilerplate language. And then from there, they go into the real business, the nuts and bolts stuff. And it's surprisingly detailed, it's surprisingly specific. They talk about how there are political exiles from England, from Kent, from other places living in Charlemagne's kingdom. And this could be understood as a sort of veiled reminder to Offa that Charlemagne has got these cards up his sleeve, which he could unleash if he ever chose to do so. They also talk about issues of trade in quite a lot of depth. And this involves English traders who have been masquerading as pilgrims to try and escape paying tolls on their way to Rome. So they address that problem. They talk about how cloaks that have been sent from England to Francia have changed in size, and Charlemagne wants them to go back to the old size. So sort of Brexit trade echoes going on there. There's also a very tantalizing reference to black stones, black rocks. And there's been a long-running debate about what on earth these black rocks might have been. They might have been kernstones for grinding grain. They might have been various other things. The best suggestion is one that's been made within the last 15 or 20 years, that they're actually referring to a super prestigious kind of black marble, which is quarried from areas in what's now Belgium, so close to the real heart of Charlemagne's power. And one slab of this black marble was used to make the memorial inscription for Pope Hadrian I, who dies in 795, so just a year before this. Could well be that the inscription is actually set up in 796. And this is actually still there. It's still outside the entrance of St. Peter's in Rome. It's one of the very few monuments that was preserved from the old church and brought into the new one in the 16th century. And it's massive. And it's black, and it's amazing, and it was brought there all the way across Europe. And so Offa wanted in on that action as well. And he and Charlemagne were just talking business and talking about it in great detail.
It is very interesting, isn't it? And it's all the more so if you consider who's on either side, because you've really made the case that Offa is probably the most important political figure. I'm not sure if that's quite the right language, but in the lower part of our islands. I think it's probably worth stressing exactly for those who don't know who Charlemagne was and what the extent of his power was, because this seems to me, I'm going to put in a very clunky but quite fun modern analogy. Isn't this Keir Starmer getting a letter from Donald Trump? This kind of, is that the dynamic?
It is, yes. I think some of my learned colleagues would perhaps not be very happy with Charlemagne being compared to Donald Trump, but
it's the first time.
Yes, the scale is similar. Yeah, no, I think that's quite right. I think that Offa he's not operating on quite the same level as Charlemagne. His kingdom isn't as big, it's not as rich. But Charlemagne, he's already king of the biggest single kingdom you've got in Western Europe when he comes to the throne in 768. Like Offa, he then rules for another nearly 50 years in his case. He's king until 814. Is also like Offa in that he adds quite a lot to his kingdom. So, like I said, he begins with most of what's now France, Belgium, Switzerland, big chunk of the Netherlands under his control. And to that, he adds Saxony, he adds Bavaria, he adds a chunk of northern Spain, he adds Italy down to Rome. It's becoming a huge entity. So from Offa's point of view in England, he is on the one hand one of the very few rulers anywhere in Western Europe who is outside Charlemagne's direct rule and with whom Charlemagne has to deal notionally as a peer. But it also means that for Offa to deal with anyone anywhere in mainland Europe, that basically means going through Charlemagne and Charlemagne's kingdom. So it's the superpower of the day, basically.
I quite liked this is obviously a dynamic relationship between the two of them over quite a period of time. And there are almost comic moments in this relationship where Offa attempts to seal a marriage between his son and heir and one of Charlemagne's daughters, which is so badly received that Charlemagne has a blockade against all Britons or anyone of the English race. I think the terms used coming onto Gaulish coasts. Is that correct?
Pretty much, yes. Although in actual fact, Offa's not necessarily the bad guy in that story so much. It looks like it starts out with Charlemagne's son, who slightly confusingly is also called Charles. He initiates an effort to try and marry one of Offa's daughters. Now, on the face of it, that's not necessarily such a bad idea because it would be tying these powerful families together, bolstering Offa's credentials, all of those things. The risk from Offa's point of view is that traditionally in the Frankish kingdom, when princes want to marry a wife, they would take a wife from one of their major vassals, their major subordinates. And so if Offa just goes along with this proposal, it could be read as putting him in that position, and he maybe doesn't want that. So what Offa does, really quite cleverly, I think, is he says he'll go along with this proposal if Charlemagne will agree to a reciprocal marriage exchange. So that is to say, one of Charlemagne's daughters would marry one of Offa's sons. And that's the point at which Charlemagne blows up. That's when Charlemagne, goes ballistic. And it's probably in part because Offa is not accepting his place, basically. He's not taking on board his place in the pecking order. But I think it's also because, it's been suggested it might also be because Charlemagne is especially close, arguably weirdly close with his daughters, and that he doesn't like the idea of them going off and marrying strange men in England.
Yeah, in distant islands. This letter itself, which sounds like it's hugely historically significant, being an early example of international diplomacy. It's obviously a horribly anachronistic phrase. Whereabouts is it kept?
Well, it doesn't survive in its original form. Hardly any letters from this period that survive in their original form, like the actual bit of parchment that was received by Offa or Charlemagne or someone else. They overwhelmingly survive in collections that were made in later times.
Could I ask you a bit of speculative history? I know this is always a bit of a mean thing to do to people, but as we're doing a bit of time traveling today, I think we can allow our imaginations a bit of playtime. So that this letter is received by Offa. If a listener was trying to, in their mind, conjure up some idea of what Offa might look like, is there anything in the broadest terms that we could say? How would you sketch that? Or what does your imagination tell you after researching this for so long?
Crumbs, that's a very good question. In terms of what Offa looked like, first of all, Offa himself, if I were wearing my sort of hard historian's hat, I'd say we don't really know. There are coins of Offa that have images on them that are supposed to represent him, but these are unlikely to be true-to-life representations, not least because they look quite different one to another. What you can say is they are consistent in showing him with no beard, no moustache, no facial hair, sometimes quite sort of fluffy, sort of Hugh Grant kind of hairdo. And that may be accurate. It looks like Offa was clearly concerned with his representation in media like this, but you can't pin too much confidence on that. In terms of the setting where Offa might have been when he receives this letter, you can go a bit further there. I think it was quite likely to have been at maybe a royal gathering or certainly a royal hall where Offa wouldn't be alone. He'd always have other people around him. He'd have some of his family. His wife is hugely important, Cunithryth. She's a major player at his court. His son, Edgefrith, is often there as well. There might be some of his major ealdormen or bishops. So he'd probably get this thing, and then he might have been able to understand Latin himself. He may even have been able to read it. I think it's more likely that someone else would have probably read it to him, and they may well also have translated it into English for him. We know that this is actually, there's a reference to this being done with the decrees that are made when these two papal legates, these two Italian bishops, turn up in England in 786. There's a reference at one point in the proceedings of what they've seen and done, that they have this sort of back and forth process of translation going on. So I think we have to imagine a fairly grand scene, or at least grand by the standards of the time. It would have been in a royal hall, it would have been in a royal gathering, it would have been a place where you've got a lot of hangers-on standing around. Probably there would have been a degree of excitement that this messenger would turn up and they'd know this was someone who came from Charlemagne. They might even have had Charlemagne's seal or something like that. There would have been tangible excitement and they would have thought, oh gosh, what's going to happen next?
Hello, it's Peter here. We try to introduce you to the very best new history books here on Travels Through Time in our own distinctive way. But for those of you who just love reading and would like to explore a little further, then on unseenhistories.com you can browse our monthly previews of a dozen or so newly released titles. You can read interviews with leading experts and features by some of the world's very best historians. To see what else made the cut, head to unseenhistories.com. That's a really nice depiction. Where should we go to next then? We're still in the same year, 796. What would you like to see next?
Well, I thought we could jump forward to the 29th of July, 796, because this is the day when Offa dies. It's one of the relatively few firm dates, down to the exact day at least, that you've got from within Offa's reign. So we know that's when he passes away. We don't know why he passes away. And because he's got so many enemies, we've got these quite detailed letters of Charlemagne from this point. I think if he had been killed, if there had been obvious foul play, we would have known about it. So most likely he just dies of natural causes, which is entirely likely after he's been on the throne for nearly 40 years. And he's probably at least in his 60s, maybe considerably older. Around this time, probably very shortly after Offa passes away, some of these kingdoms that had been under Mercian dominance, like East Anglia and Kent, they break away. They have members of the old royal dynasty who've been waiting in the wings, and they swoop back in to try and re-establish themselves as independent rulers, basically. So Offa's successor, his son, faces an immediate uphill struggle in that way. And I think that, as with many kingdoms in early medieval Britain, when a ruler dies, that's a moment of real crisis. That's a moment of weakness.
And you can imagine that for a lot of people at that time, they wouldn't have known anything else but this one ruler. A little bit like us with Queen Elizabeth II, not so many years ago. That sense that something very deep in the tectonic plates had shifted. I suppose later on we become used to this idea, which is very strongly present. It goes right through to Charles I of the divine right of kings, and obviously that's not quite around yet by the sound of things. But we do have obviously early Christianity, so maybe that's in development, or maybe this is part of the development of that story. The idea that you've got a pool of people who are apart from the normal people, and one of those would be suitable to be the ruler. Is that correct? Maybe?
That's more or less right, yes. I don't think at this stage it's not just based on religion. Christianity is a major part of how you install your king, but how you choose your king, that seems to be a little bit more fluid. That's based more on these traditional secular views of who is a viable candidate for kingship. And of course, sometimes you've got characters like King Canute who just come in with a big enough army that they're able to conquer and take over themselves, and then everyone has to just kind of accept that clearly this is what God wanted. If it's a matter of succession and choosing someone from the family you've got, then there's a clear sense that there is a pool of appropriate people and you take your pick from among them. This is why, in fact, Offa's succession is really interesting and one of the main mysteries of his reign, because Offa more or less comes out of the blue. There's no record of him appearing in charters or doing anything of note at all before he becomes king. He's got a couple of ancestors, a couple of, I think, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, who are referred to in charters from the time of Athelbald, probably, assuming that the character with the same name is the same one as Offa's genealogy refers to. So it suggests that Offa is being picked partly because he's got this family link, that he has got the appropriate heritage, the appropriate ancestry, but it's also probably because they have a well-established group of people who are running the show, and they're deliberately selecting someone who they think they can work with, who they think will cooperate with them, who may well be in their pocket already in some respects, and that's how Offa gets picked. And it may well be how then Cernwulf gets picked late in 796 when Offa's son dies after he does.
I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Was there any tangible relics? I mean, this is the question. Or did anyone ever claim, to your knowledge, because you write about the afterlife and the cultural meaning of Offa as well, or was he just so out of fashion that no one would really want an Offa relic? But it seems to belong to that period of time when those things were around.
Yeah, I mean, relics on the whole for this period are mostly a facet of saints. If someone is associated with holiness and they are cultivated as a member of the saintly canon, then typically relics would be sought or possibly even just created if you don't have any real ones. And this character that Offa has killed in 794, Ethelbert of East Anglia, who's another king, he then gets cultivated as a saint. So there are relics of him. People would go to his shrine on pilgrimage. Since Offa himself was not a saint, and I don't think there's any reason to think he was ever even close to being a saint, there are no relics. In fact, there is a wonderfully vivid story in some of the later medieval, the 12th, 13th century chronicles, which talk about Offa, saying that his tomb used to be visible just outside Bedford, beside the river, but that eventually, at some point in probably the 12th or 13th century, it was destroyed by floods, and Offa's sarcophagus just vanished beneath the waves and was gone forever. So there are no remains of Offa, to the best of my knowledge, that survive. There was a story told at St Albans that he was buried there, but that's quite unlikely because there are slightly earlier ones which say clearly Bedford. St Albans is important though because it's the main bastion of memory of Offa as a good guy, as a hero, as someone who was worthy of good remembrance. And this is because he seems to have been the refounder of St Albans towards the end of his reign. He patronizes it, he gives them lots of land, he rebuilds the monastery there. And this meant that they were all over Offa in St Albans. From the 10th century onwards, we know that they were really active in cultivating his memory. They had charters of him, they created charters of him. They even, a monk scholar there called Matthew Paris in the 13th century, even produced a supposed biography of Offa. It's called The Lives of the Two Offas. The first Offa supposedly being this much, much earlier one in what would have been the 4th or 5th century AD, who lived in Angeln in northern Germany. And they then imagine that he's a sort of precursor to the Mercian Offa. And this is a wonderful text if you like your history involving big battles and wizards and magic and all sorts of the daring do that you get in things like Geoffrey of Monmouth. It's not very historically reliable, though. This just represents Matthew Paris's literary verve, his ability to weave together the little information that he did have with a lot of imagination to produce something that works well as a piece of literature, but which is pretty problematic as a work of history.
Well, here he dies, and we're in the middle of the year. It's a good time to reflect on these things, what he was going to become. And I know you've got this phrase in the book of looking through a glass darkly, which is maybe not your own to begin with, but it's a nice way to consider all of this. We've got one place to go yet in this year. Do you want to take us to our final scene, please?
I will. This is the death we don't know exactly what day it was, but we know it was in December 796. This is when Offa's son and heir, Edgefrith, passes away. And he was a young man. He was probably in his 20s, maybe a little bit older. And this was Offa's only son. He has daughters, but they're not usually seen as viable candidates for succession at this stage. So this is the end of the road for Offa's immediate family as rulers, unfortunately. So this is the crashing down of many of Offa's plans, many of Offa's schemes. He clearly hoped that his family would become the dominant force in Mercia, in southern England, for a very long time indeed. But fortune was not on their side. So Edgefrith dies. Mercia is thrown into even deeper chaos, because now not only do they have no Offa, they've got no king from Offa's family at all. So they have to go and find this new ruler, Cernwulf, who does manage to get the show back on the road over the next couple of years. He takes over Kent and East Anglia again. He restores basically the status quo that there had been under Offa. But what's striking with Cernwulf is that he doesn't seem to have had any aspirations to extend that rule. He doesn't try to take over Wessex. He doesn't try to take over Northumbria. He doesn't try to go and take over the Welsh kingdoms. It looks like there's a sense that Offa's achievement, Offa's kingship, was what they should shoot for, but no further. That Offa has set the benchmark, basically. And so that's where they stick with Mercia into the early 9th century until the West Saxons rise up and defeat them in battle in 825, and then they become much more dominant in the south of England. They take over Kent, they take over Essex, they take over Sussex, and this means that Mercia is still powerful, but it's much more on a level pegging with Wessex.
Yeah, I'm trying just to think here on the meaning of this scene. Is it almost like an apogee, like a high point for Mercia? Because it seems to me that Offa has been such an effective ruler. He seems to, as you say, be a unifying political figure. He's strong. He's maybe whatever. But when he goes, something's definitely missing and things fall to pieces. Is what we're looking at here in December of that year a high point, but when maybe the spirit is going out of Mercia as a political force? Do you think that's right?
I'd say the high point is probably actually with the first of these scenes where Offa is receiving this letter, where, of course, Offa himself is still there in the driving seat, probably old, probably quite cantankerous, probably a bit suspicious of people around him. There are hints of this from some of the letters of Alcuin. I think that what we see later on in 796 is a signal of how, while Offa was very powerful, the nature of authority in earlier Anglo-Saxon England was still quite personal, and it could be knocked relatively easily. These kingdoms could be taken apart, they could be dismembered pretty rapidly. That's not to say Offa was weak, that Offa was doing something bad. It's just the nature of how politics works at this point. You can see similar things happening right through into the 10th and 11th centuries. And yeah, I think 796 is a high point, but also one which shows the precipice-like nature of political life at this time, that since it's depending on kings and what kings did and how kings operated as the heart of the system, when you've got one king who goes, that means others know it's open season. Others know they can come in and seize back their old lands. They can challenge the new guy who's not as well established. And yeah, it just turns the tables, basically.
Do we know anything about Ecgfrith, whose deathbed we're standing beside at the moment, I suppose, metaphorically? Does he exist in anything more than name, or is he quite difficult to get to as well?
It's hard to know too much about Ecgfrith because he is only king for about, less than 6 months, about 5 months or so. There are some hints that he's trying to do things differently from Offa during that time. He restores lands that Offa had taken to some monasteries that he wanted to presumably patronize. It suggests that he might be consciously trying to basically reconcile some of the opponents of Offa's regime. So yes, he is. We can learn a little bit about what he's like as king. Beyond that, it's hard to say a great deal. There's almost nothing that gives us any clue to how he got on with his sisters or anything like that. What is unusual is that there's no evidence that he marries. There's no evidence that he's got children. And since, like I said, he's probably in his 20s or so when he dies, that's pretty unusual for an Anglo-Saxon king. And it may well be that he had health problems. It may well be that there were reasons why he didn't marry, but we can't be sure of that. We don't know why. We also don't know why he dies, why Ecgfrith dies. Alcuin makes quite a lot of hay out of this because he sees it as comeuppance for the sins that Offa committed. He refers to Offa having spilt a huge amount of blood to secure the succession of his son. It's not quite clear whether that means in 787 when he's raised up to kingship or 796 when Offa himself has died. And even if whichever of those dates he means, it's not quite clear what the bloodletting might be either. But there's no reference to Ecgfrith being murdered, no reference to him being killed in that way. So again, the best guess is that it's natural causes.
It is really tantalising though, isn't it? Because you've got two very different interpretations there, for which you've obviously made the strong case that it was just life was going along on its way. An old king died and it was quite unfortunate that the heir followed him soon after. But it does sound like there's a hint of faction, there's a hint of acrimony in the air. Yeah. Well, I think we're going to have to let you go very shortly. But you're right that Offa seems to have had all the attributes of a great ruler except a contemporary historian. That's a fair point, I believe, although your book does supply something of a bit of a gap. One more question, though, before we do finish this tour through the year 796. If I gave you the opportunity to pick up an object from that year, this is a bit of material history. I know there's loads of things that you'd probably want because there's so many questions. They really do abound. But is there anything in particular that you would like?
Yes, I had to think about this the other night when I was writing some notes about this, and I think what I'd probably choose is the other half of the correspondence with Charlemagne. I'd get the letter which Offa had written, which Offa wrote in response to this, or the letter which prompted this. Charlemagne refers to Offa having sent letters to him, so we know these existed. But unfortunately, they do not survive. So that's what I choose, I think. I'd like to try and get a sense of how Offa described himself vis-a-vis Charlemagne, what he highlighted about his achievements, what he asked the Frankish ruler to do. I think getting more of a sense of where Offa was coming from, what Offa thought, would really be quite special.
We'd hear his voice for the first time, I guess, because it doesn't really come through clearly, does it, in the scraps that remain. It's such an interesting idea. Well, listen, Rory Naismith, author of Offa, King of the Mercians, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you very much for coming on Travel Through Time.
Thank you.
That was me, Peter Moore, talking to Rory Naismith about his new book, Offa, King of the Mercians. To read more about the history we covered in this episode, along with others on Vivaldi, Handel, Renoir, and a host of others, do head to unseenhistories.com. I'll be back with an episode on the Georgian Masquerade next week. Till then, thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.